Opposition Day from my New Democratic colleague, the Member of Parliament for Saskatoon West, is coming at a critical time in Canada as we face the worst housing crisis we have ever experienced. Exploding housing prices, increasing rents, shortage of rental housing, long wait lists for non-market housing, and more homelessness. The portion of household expenses that Canadians are dedicating to housing has been rising while their incomes aren't. I thank her for her work on this issue, and this focus shows the heart of who we are as New Democrats, that we are here for Canadians to raise their issues when the governments of Liberals and past Conservatives have failed to hear their cries across our country on such a critical issue. People across our country, Madam Speaker, are working harder than ever. And although the Liberals will simply tell you, everyone's doing fine, our policy is amazing, it's helping everyone. You know, there are days when I can't even understand the disdain, the level of disdain that they show to Canadian people when they cite this, because so many people across our country are not doing fine, are not doing well. When 46% of Canadians are $200 away from financial trouble, do Liberals honestly think that that means that people are doing well? Next time they pat themselves on the back for political points, I want them to think of that number. 46% are $200 away from trouble. That is not fine. I can't help but think that these are the same Canadians who are struggling to maintain or get a roof to put over their heads. We can't even find one for them in our broken system. And I think in fairness, some Canadians today during this debate may be wondering what is affordable housing? There are a lot of different thoughts that people have when you talk about affordable housing, but what we're talking about is spending 30% or more of your take-home pay on housing costs. If you are spending 30% or more of your take-home pay on housing costs in Canada, then you are not in an affordable housing situation. And housing is a spectrum. It has to include homelessness, precarious housing, market rental, social housing, co-op housing, all the way to home ownership, Madam Speaker. And no one on this scale is immune from this crisis. Anyone on this scale can be experiencing difficulties in their housing situation in Canada today. Measures taken by this government aren't addressing the urgency of the situation. 90% of the funds earmarked by the Liberals for the National Housing Strategy won't even be spent until after the next election, even though 1.7 million families are living in inadequate, unaffordable, or unsuitable homes right now today. Safe, affordable housing should be a right. But for too many, it's increasingly out of reach thanks to skyrocketing rents and ballooning home prices that have reached rural communities like the one in Essex that I represent. In Essex today, housing affordability and availability is reaching a critical level for people who would like to stay in their rural towns. Madam Speaker, I grew up in a small rural town. I live in a small rural town. In fact, where I live, Puce is not even called a town. It's so incredibly tiny. And in these particular communities, housing is even more significant an issue because it simply doesn't exist. And when it comes onto the market, it's gone very quickly, and social housing is non-existent. So according to the Rental Housing Index in our riding of Essex, 46% of households are spending over 30% of their income on rent and utilities. And shockingly, 19% are spending more than 50% of their take-home pay on their housing costs. Madam Speaker, almost 1 in 5 people in Essex is spending half of what they earn to pay for their housing costs alone. That's not sustainable for people, Madam Speaker. For those who own their homes, there are also significant problems affording their rent. For those who don't, 11.8%, according to Stats Canada, are paying more than 30% of their income for their home costs. I apologize, that is for people who own their own homes. So 11.8% according to Stats Canada. Now that was in 2016. And I think it's safe to assume, given the housing bubble that has reached us down in southwestern Ontario, that this number has increased over the last 3 years. And that certainly is what I'm hearing in my office and what people in our community are talking about. I also know that wages have stagnated, and the income of people in my region has not been growing. People are struggling to make ends meet, and income inequality continues to grow. In the rural communities like ours, employers are not able to find workers because of a lack of housing. We need a strategy that addresses the unique needs of rural employers and communities like mine in Essex. I have many employers, Madam Speaker, who come into my office who are trying to attract people from all over the country and certainly from Windsor to come out to the county to work. There's no place for them to live. And driving back and forth every day isn't an option for people. We have no public transportation out in rural ridings either. So people are left to find their own way to try to find employment, to try to find housing in communities where there are employment, and we know that there's a severe shortage. Human rights organizations in Canada and around the world have repeatedly drawn attention to the effects of gender inequality and discrimination in women's access to suitable housing. And senior women living alone are much more likely to live in poverty. And these are serious issues that impact people across my riding. Madam Speaker, down in Essex, we at once were a booming area of manufacturing, good paying jobs with pensions. And I see widows of their husbands who've passed away, who had those good pensions, who are in homes who can't afford to stay in those homes, or who have had to sell that home because they have pennies to live on, because of course companies have gone bankrupt and left pennies on pension dollars for widows and widowers in my area. And so it really is difficult for these people, these senior women, to afford the home that they once built and loved and raised their family in, but then to go out and sell that home and try to look for an alternative that just simply doesn't exist. In December, I visited the Welcome Center shelter for women in Windsor, and this is a homeless shelter for women. And there were several women from the county, from my riding there, Madam Speaker. And this one woman was in tears. And she was telling me how she lived in Amherstburg, one of the towns in my riding. She had her family there, all of her friends there, all of her support system. And she was forced to come into the city because she was experiencing homelessness and couldn't find an affordable or available rental unit inside the town that she lived in her whole entire life. It was heartbreaking to listen to this woman's story. She's experienced so many of these, the spectrum of home, of having a home, not having a home, and she can't find a solution. She wants desperately to get back to the town to be able to live and be close to her support system, but she doesn't see that within her reach, Madam Speaker, and that's heartbreaking. I think it's important to talk about how we've come to this point, and the root of all of this issue that we're facing and what we're discussing today are political decisions that have been made by Liberal and Conservative governments. In 1983, the Paul Martin Liberal government canceled the National Affordable Housing Strategy, and we lost 500,000 units of affordable housing. And then the Conservatives came to power and did nothing to address the shortage over their 10 years in power. And now the Liberals are trying to clean up a crisis that they created. And they're doing an incredibly poor job of it over the past 3 years, Madam Speaker. There are only 2 provinces who have continued to fund housing on their own, and that's BC and Quebec. We can do this, Madam Speaker, but again, it takes investment in people instead of corporate giveaways. After World War II, we built 300,000 units in 36 months. I'm sorry, Madam Speaker, I'm going to have to interrupt my speech because I can't hear over the member from Fort York Spadina across the aisle. If you could please be respectful, I would appreciate it. So again, after World War II, we built 300,000 units in 36 months. This is the kind of commitment that is required to help get us back to being a country where people are cared for and not left behind. Madam Speaker, I want to end by talking about 3 cases in my riding, 3 people who I know who are experiencing difficulty with housing. And the first is Crystal, who came to us because her brother Daryl was living in a tent because he couldn't find affordable housing. We helped to work with him to find a subsidy, but this story is not unique, and I hear my colleagues talk about tent cities from coast to coast to coast because people simply have no other option to try to have a roof over their head. Fred, who's a former coworker of mine, he met with me about his daughter. His daughter, Tracey, is a single mother with 5 kids living with her father. He told us the kids sleep in his living room because she can't find affordable housing. These are the stories that we're facing in our ridings, Madam Speaker, and this is why New Democrats will never stop talking about housing and issues that matter to Canadians.
Comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'll thank the member for Saskatoon.